How do you measure something so messy as learning that happens in the small instances between an interaction with a teacher, that happens in the playground interaction they have with a child outside, that happens when they come to school on the bus in the morning and they're late and they have to cope with this idea of being late for school and the emotions that exist with that? That's all learning. It's not just a test.
Longer for us as educators to make sure that children become more of who we are, but it's really to help children find who they are and become more of who they are. And I think that when we are able to do that, we create human beings that are secure in their own identity, can appreciate other people's identity and value that, and create a more inclusive, peaceful world.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School, and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach.
Today we will be speaking with Loretta, Fernando-Smith, and David Walton. Dave is Assistant Principal for Assessment and Reporting at Bangkok Patana School, where he leads initiatives to create a data culture rooted in kindness, aiming to empower educators to use each student's unique data constellation to design inclusive, responsive learning experiences.
And Loretta is currently the Curriculum Coordinator and Associate Principal at Frankfurt International School Wiesbaden. A fourth-generation educator, a cross-cultural kid, an author and a TEDx speaker, she weaves storytelling and scholarship to reimagine identity, inclusion, and belonging in schools.
So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen.
Loretta, Dave, it's so fantastic to have you on this podcast. I'm particularly interested in this conversation because I think it's going to raise and wrestle with some of the big challenges that international schools face in terms of data use and data culture in particular. So I wondered if we could kick off with a question about culture. How would you describe the data culture in your school? And as well as describing it, can you think back to what shaped it, but also what is continuing to shape it now?
I think I'm kind of on a journey at the moment in terms of that data culture, as you are aware of, Matthew, and you've been working with me for about 2 years now about what we perceive at my school to be the data culture of the school. I think it's changed significantly in that 2 years, and it's still it's not even, I would say, probably 25% finished yet. I don't think we've actually changed the culture away from what existed before. We went through a process we've changed reports, we've changed assessment systems, we've changed things that really were stuck very much in the past for a long time, is what I would say. We were using outdated assessment grids for children's data when it comes to their academics. And that kind of drove what people believed to be important, very much so. And we had people that were looking at data thinking it was numbers and academic grades on a page. We used to report graphs to parents, and our reports were purely academic. So when you think about how you develop a culture, or what the data culture was, the things that we were driving through were all driven by an academic outcome, I would say. We never reported on anything beyond that to parents or to even to our teachers, really. The drive through as well, we're such a large school that actually it becomes very difficult to think about where that academia then turns into as they hit secondary school from our primary school, because we're IB at the end, and as we all know, it's a competitive market out there in the international schools, and there's still that drive for academic success and university places by the time they come to an end. So we're in a state of flux, I would say. Our primary school is learning a lot and moving in the right direction. And I wouldn't say we're anywhere near there yet, and how we develop that culture further will come down to how that's communicated by me and what the structures and systems are that we put in place. I'm just going to digress a little bit. In terms of the culture, I really heard something the other day in a meeting I was in, and I sat in a meeting and talked to some middle leaders. I just stood at the back, and they referred to the data, that all important thing that exists, the data. And then the conversation very quickly went into this idea of numbers. And then they mentioned an assessment week. And I immediately froze on the spot because it seems to go against everything I've been trying to communicate. And it just made me realize that we are not there yet. And there's still a lot of work to do because they're still referring to it as that number and that assessment on a piece of paper that doesn't look beyond and a wider picture of this constellation that I'm aiming for with the school. And I flagged it and I put it in my memory, and then I've done some of the sessions with some people since and talked about it in a wider perspective. But yeah, it's a tough one really, because how do you balance that idea of academic with well-being? Me and Matthew have talked about this lots, and the wider picture of a student, and make sure that people value them as two equal parts, and that there's more to that picture or that story of a child than just that number that sits on paper. And the different stakeholders that exist within it. You've got parents that are driven in Asia to get those results for their children, for them to be doctors, for them to be high achievers outside, and pressures from home. And then, yeah, it's a tough one. Our data culture, describe our school's data culture mixed still would be my best word at the moment. We are making strides forward, but it's mixed. And it's to do with a mixed message and a move away from what we maybe traditionally believe as teachers to be what we're taught in pedagogy when we first learn teaching. It's all about these numbers and getting children there. That's what I was taught when I was training to be a teacher. And it's this shift in thinking now about this bigger picture of a child and what makes them truly them.
Thank you so much for that, Dave. And there's lots that will resonate with everyone, I'm sure. Before I hand it over to Loretta, as someone partly with a background in linguistics and sociolinguistics, I'm really struck by your mention of the definite article there, right? When we put the before anything, it limits the thing that we are describing as the. So, for example, there will be different people in our schools who say the parents think this, or the students think this, or the staff think that. I often hear problematic talk of the science shows that, or the research shows that. You know, as soon as we put the there, it closes it down. And there is this powerful but nebulous force in schools, which is the data, capital T, capital D. And I wonder whether that's part of the data culture we're trying to wrestle with. What's your take on that, Loretta?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have to agree that this idea of the, right? And what does the data even mean? And how, like Dave says, so often traditionally we've looked at data as numbers, as quantitative things that we can measure. And is that the data? Is that the picture of the student, the child, the future citizen, the current citizen in front of us? And what do we need to get out of it? So our school's journey started with a strategic sort of impact. And we had a lot of different strategic impacts. And a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, we kind of narrowed them down to just 3. And the one big one in there was personalized learning. And so data came from this idea of personalized learning being important. And so in order to provide personalized learning, we needed to see the child as a person in order to provide that. The other part of our strategic impact that really also plays, I think, into our data culture is the idea of well-being and belonging. So that was another thing that we thought was important, and it continues to play into our data culture. Just like Dave mentioned, we're on a journey, so we have not figured this out. And just like Dave mentioned, there are different takes on what the data is in the early years and in the elementary school versus the upper school. And just like Dave mentioned, the data looks different to an educator in those different places than it does to students even, and their conception of what the data is and what it has been traditionally. And of course, it looks different to our families as well, because they have this background of how they grew up with the definition of the data, right? And so I think for us, that whole culture of the whole school is really important. And it started off with, I would say, some leadership, going with this idea of personalized learning and really also valuing well-being and belonging and trying to create some sort of a data dashboard that would show the whole student and help us provide that personalized learning. But how we continue to grapple with that as a community and change that culture from the data and the traditional definition of data that we all carry in our lenses that we bring to one that really truly honors the whole student and the whole human being that we have in front of us, and also recognizes our own personal self in that journey of looking at the data, right? So I think that's definitely a journey that we are on, and I imagine we'll continue to be on for a while.
I imagine our listeners here are coming from a lot of different places in their understanding of what the data means or what sorts of data issues schools are encountering. And I'm wondering if you could sort of encapsulate what is your why? Like, why is it so important to move away from this numeric academic focus of data that you were talking about, Dave, and to transition the culture to something different? When we say that, schools are learning institutions and that's the role of the school, and this is how we show the learning, is we have a test that everybody takes, and when they show progress on this is how we know it's not just wishful thinking. And the parents in the communities and the religious organizations, they're in charge of the social emotional piece and the well-being piece. When you have conversations with people who are coming from that sort of perspective, what's your why?
I think the why boils back to this whole child idea. If we are thinking about what learning is for a child, especially when I think about my position in a primary school and younger learners, is learning linear? Is learning straightforward for any child at any point? No. Does it flux? Does it change? Yes. Is learning messy? Absolutely. How can we say that the development of a child who is ready to be, I don't know, whatever they're going to be when they're older, in the centuries that we don't know, and we don't know what they'll be asked to achieve or they'll be asked to do? How are we saying that a number on a piece of paper that's a mathematical test will then prepare them to go out into that world where we as adults don't even know what their skill set will look like for them in a world that's changing all the time? So for me, the why is to develop a child that has the skills to access and to be adaptable and independent in a changing environment. So it's not just a mathematical number. And I'm not saying that there are no place for academics at all. That totally is not what I'm saying. There needs to be. That always has existed. It's always going to exist. But learning is completely beyond just a piece of paper. And the why is that a child develops in all different ways, not just in academic ways. They develop socially, they develop emotionally. They need to learn to adapt, to change, to think about their impact in different scenarios, think about who they are personally, and to be able to explain that and verbalize that with anybody that they come into contact with. It's not just about the hard skills of academia with a child and in primary school. It's about their more rounded well-being, their more rounded development as a human. And I always think about what my core values exist as a leader, and I always have kindness in there. And I think if we are ever going to be thinking about how we are kind as educators, as leaders, as people, as humans, how do we develop a child to really create that kindness within them for every situation they enter? And that's not the skill of maths, and it's not the skill of English. There's a part of that to gain access to different things in the world, potentially. But to be a kind human is more important to me than actually the numbers on a piece of paper. And I think there's more to the world than those figures. Yeah, learning is messy. I think if it boils back to anything, learning is completely messy. How do you measure something so messy as learning that happens in the small instances between an interaction with a teacher, that happens in the playground interaction they have with a child outside, that happens when they come to school on the bus in the morning and they're late and they have to cope with this idea of being late for school and the emotions that exist with that? That's all learning. It's not just a test. And the why is we need to have children that can cope with any situation that's thrown at them in a world that was ever changing for me. And if anything, we can teach them to be kind and look after each other. I think that's going to make them a better human.
Yeah. I'm kind of going to go on that same strain. And I'm going to start off with saying, looking back at the history of schools, why were schools created? What was the origin of standardized education? It started in the Industrial Revolution. It had a purpose to serve. We were creating human beings that would be able to go back into the world for a specific purpose to contribute in a very specific way. It was industrial. We were cogs in a wheel. That's what we were creating. School's purpose on many levels at that point was to ensure belonging by making sure we fit in. but we no longer live in that world. And we can see the difficulties that arise when we are made to just fit in. There's this quote by Shefali Tsabari, and she talks about the path to a more peaceful world begins with a childhood that's resplendent with a sense of worth and the freedom to be true to ourselves. And so I think the purpose of education has changed, as Dave has mentioned. It's no longer to be more like everyone else. It's longer for us as educators to make sure that children become more of who we are, but it's really to help children find who they are and become more of who they are. And I think that when we are able to do that, we create human beings that are secure in their own identity, can appreciate other people's identity and value that, and create a more inclusive, peaceful world. When we talk about why should we gather data that's more than just academics, more than just numbers, the importance of seeing the whole child in order to develop their whole self, their identity, as well as make sure that they have the knowledge, the understanding, and the skills to take action and be who they are in that world becomes really important. And so it isn't even a balance of academic and social, emotional, or personality or identity. It really becomes about those two things talking to each other, being in conversation, and us as educators being able to see that or even hear that conversation. Because I do think it's our duty to help the whole child. And I mean, again, research tells us now, social emotional research, if children do not feel safe, they can't access the academics. And so even if we wanted to value one side more than the other, we now have research that shows us that, we need social emotional in order to even address the academics.
I was just going to add on to that and this kind of responsibility as an educator. And I said about learn being messy and what Loretta said there about the world changing and helping children find out who they are. If we just focusing on as an educator and it being our responsibility, how can we say that a child is a number, and how can we sit there and go, yeah, this is all we have on this child, and not understand why that child is like that, or understand why the bigger picture exists behind those numbers that we have? And if we look at academics, for example, I'm going to look at a maths figure. What is behind that? Why are they doing that? It's not just about me sitting a test on that day. It's about who I am. It's about the bus journey I had into school. It's about what I like to do. It's about whether that test paper appealed to me as a child because I love horses. Whether that piece of writing I've been asked to do that's independent, did that teacher get it right for me? Did they adapt to my situation at that moment in time and give me what I need to succeed and to feel like I can develop further as a human? And actually knowing a bigger picture of data in terms of more than just that number helps teachers to be more responsive and more adaptive and more in tune with the classroom that sits in front of them than just the obvious, the data word that relates to numbers.
And what it seems to me that you're both talking about there, as well as embracing the mess, is also embracing the idea of a duality rather than being tricked about some sort of dualism. Yeah, because if we're talking about holism, it can't be an either or. It can't be more this, less that. It has to be everything together, even when that seems messy.
Here's something you probably already know. Independent school people wear multiple hats. You're the IT director who also coaches soccer, the development officer who's also an alum, the parent who sits on the finance committee. But too often your school systems don't see it that way. Student information lives here, parent data lives there, alumni records and enrollment info somewhere else. It's fragmented, sometimes chaotic. And when data lives in silos, you can't support your community the way you want to. Veracross is different. Our database is built around the person, not a business function. Our one-person, one-record platform connects every department with real-time data, designed to build connections, not disrupt them. No silos, no switching between systems, just seamless collaboration. And when your data reflects the whole person, you can use it to do great work for your school, breaking down stereotypes, supporting well-being, and working smarter. Veracross.com, trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
But I wonder if we can take a slightly different direction now. Let's imagine this conversation is us going on a hike, and there's one of those markers that said we could go on a scenic outlook, a little diversion there. So let's go on a little diversion here. You've alluded to this theme a little bit, both of you yourselves, and this has come up in other conversations as well. I wonder, is it possible to build a truly contiguous data journey from 3 through to 18? Or to put it simply, the messiness and the duality you've talked about, does that play out in the same way for elementary and for upper school? What does data, or can data, look like in primary or elementary that you wish secondary, middle, or high school held on to more closely?
I think in the early years, there is still, or in the elementary years, in the primary years, there's still a acknowledgement of that we need to see the whole child and everything else that's happening around the child. So there's more interaction with families and parents. There's this recognition that families contribute a lot of data that's really helpful. Often if a child had a meltdown in my class, I would, call the families and find out what had happened that day, or if there was something going on at home. So this idea of that whatever happens outside the building still contributes to what happens within the building. There's probably a little bit more curiosity around that as well, which I think, again, can inform data culture in the school. What else do I want to say? There seems to be a finality in the early years around data. Like what you get is what you get. There isn't the flexibility per se. Like when you're sitting with a younger child doing a drawing, you're gathering data, but you might have a conversation with that child or an interaction with that child. It's almost like meaning making together. Whereas often in the older years, in high school, for example, you're given a test and that's what informs your data. So I think there's a lot of different things that slightly differ. And I think really what we need to ask ourselves when we think about data and like a continuous journey, a continuous collection for children's data is, what do we all value enough to notice, right? What is it that we at the core value enough to notice? And that's going to look different with 3-year-olds than it is going to with 18-year-olds. But what is it at the core of it all that we value enough to notice? And so I do think aligning, our practices and our pedagogy and but also having sort of systems and structures in place. Like when do we have those times to collaborate? When are those meetings happening where we can talk about this all together? And where are those transition places where collaboration needs to happen a little bit more and look at the needs, right? Because there are certain needs, even not school-imposed, outside needs, university needs, parent needs, that can still align to what we value enough to notice. And then looking at like longitudinal portfolios that it's not just my responsibility now, but it's this continuous journey that I'm looking at. It's for the child rather than that portfolio piece right there in the moment. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think obviously we have to recognize that the needs of a 3-year-old are in many ways very different from the needs of an 18-year-old, right? Having said that, every international school that I know has a set of guiding statements for the whole school. It says what its values are for the whole school. It says what its strategic intents are for the whole school, its vision and mission for the whole school. And yet, an awful lot of international schools measure different things in very different ways for the oldest kids than they do for the youngest. And sure, there are external forces at play, but I'm not sure it's entirely that. And I suppose what I'm trying to understand is it inevitable and necessary that data becomes such a different thing in so many schools as kids get older? Or is there a necessity, however much we might fight against it, for data to work in very similar ways across? What are your thoughts on that, Dave?
I think you think about what you are assessing a child on or what you're looking for in a child, and it's often contextual and based in that situation, in that moment in time. Children go through development stages that, as you said, Matthew, at a young age, maybe you're looking at different things that they're still finding out more about the world. I know they are when they're 18, but they're still trying to figure out how they interact with things. They're still trying to figure out how they go to the toilet at break time, or where they would go, or who they would seek out if they needed help or support. Yes, that question still comes when they're later. However, it's a different set of skills, I think. So when we talk about a culture that exists, or a journey that exists through a school about what we assess and what we report, I think there are things that are similar, and I always think things will change and morph into something slightly different. But I think what's core to you thinking about data as a journey, a child's journey through, is that you're asking similar questions. And I think I was just trying to think there about what questions I've been trying to pose to some of my staff. And it's about, are we doing enough? Do we know enough? And that question that you've asked me before, Matthew, what don't we know? And will this help us? Because you're not going to be able to collect everything. We can't force change in what we collect sometimes. We can't you could go on forever. I said this to staff again the other day. We could keep collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting. But what we're going to do with it and what we're going to use it for, and like this vision and ethos we talk about that exists through the school, I think it's accessed in kind of different ways by different year teams. But I think the overarching idea still exists within what they do. And that journey, although not clear in transition, like Loretta mentioned, sometimes there's transition points where I think would be so much better in what we do in transitions for children and how we support them with the transition and how data's passed through. I'd like to think, I mean, it might not be true at all, but I'd like to think that maybe everybody that is in our school sings off a similar page when it comes to wanting to support a child. And I know I've talked about that before, but does it boil back to that when you think about the data that you have, what you know about a child? Every teacher should want the best for that child. And yes, numbers are important, but actually, are we asking that question, is there something else here? Do I need to look at something else? And even that simple question brings a school together in what they value a little bit. They start to go, is there something else? What don't I know? And we're not perfect at it. Absolutely not. But I do think, and I've spoke to some secondary colleagues, and obviously, my wife is also a secondary colleague. She works at the secondary school at our school. And I know that the position she's in, and I've seen it, they want the same things. It doesn't look the same. But I do think there is some commonality in process and procedures and the way that we interact. However, that differs if you look at a different stakeholder. So if I look at our community and our stakeholders outside of the school, what do they value? And I would say that's the hardest idea to change when it comes to a data journey, because they want results at the end. Our parents want some results that sit at the end where a child goes to university, and that's what they value. So when I sit in a meeting with some of them, they don't want to know what Johnny did yesterday with his artwork or whether he's had a fallout sometimes. They want to know what his maths is and they want to know what his English is. And I think that develops a journey through that actually we still have to lean into sometimes. But we need to know that our staff are always kind of asking that other question, what exists behind here? Do we? I can't 100% guarantee it. But I do think things can look different at different parts in that journey. But it's how we've connected with like a core question or an ethos or something like that. And I know, Matthew, we've talked about that well-being and learning. And yeah, this is when I've tested my mission, vision and values at the bottom, the ethos of our school. And we've got 3 things. And I've written a few documents, Matthew, that you've looked at and you went, this doesn't sing any of that. And it's about having an awareness and just checking yourself sometimes, I think.
Can I go back to what Matthew said, what you said, Matthew, and also what Dave said, like going back to what we value and our mission and vision statements, our definitions of what learning looks like, what we want our graduate to look like. A lot of schools have that. Most schools have that. And most schools somewhere, international schools in these documents have that they want to develop global citizens that are internationally minded, right? And yet when we talk about KPIs, key performance indicators, what do we mostly look at schools? What's mostly advertised on LinkedIn or out on a website? It's a graph about our graduating scores and the top universities that children went to, right? And so I think that's where I ask again, what do we all value enough to notice? And if we say our mission and vision is this, if we say this is our goal as a school, then it is already part of the school. That is what parents are signing up for. That's what we're educators are working towards. And you know, I agree with Dave. We all have good intentions. We're all showing up for the kids. But even as an educator in the classroom, you might value student agency, and yet you might act in a way that at that moment doesn't value it by lining them up and making them walk in that particular line, right? Like you do things because you just get into the routine of doing things and you would think that that's the way it's meant to be done. And I think it's always important to pause and just reflect. This is our mission. This is what we say we've all agreed to notice to value. Is what we're doing right now in data, in the way that we're showing up for kids and the way that we're seeing kids still reflect that thing. And so I do think it is possible to measure global citizenship and international mindedness as a KPI, just as it is IB scores or graduating scores, And so I think that's, just being really intentional about that can also shift the culture of the parent community and the community at large of what the data should look like.
I wonder then, before I hand it back to Paul to take you back onto the main hiking path, right? Dave, you talked about needing to cater for the needs and expectations of the parents. But I've also found myself questioning more and more, do the parents have the expectations that we think they have? Because that's all we talk about, right? So it's kind of what you were alluding to there, Loretta. If we were perhaps more true to our guiding statements, might that actually have an impact on what our parents do feel that they need and want and expect? But let me phrase the question just slightly differently before I hand back to Paul. Maybe through an asset lens. Let's imagine a future, maybe 5 years' time, 10 years' time, whereby we do have this continuous, contiguous, consistent data journey where however we assess at whatever age is true to our guiding statements. What have our teachers of the oldest years learnt from early years practitioners about data, and what have our early years practitioners learnt from the teachers of the IB diploma teachers about data, such that we do have this consistent, coherent whole? Can you, each of you, speak to that question a little bit before we go back onto the main path?
I can touch on that. I think that our early years practitioners have this thing where they look at it's definitely everything that they do when we talk about the whole child and the development and social emotional development and how they monitor, and everything they look at is a part of their collection of that child. It's a photo, it's them playing in the sand, it's them going in the mud kitchen and how they interact with their friends. I think what I've heard of that we're trying to develop in our secondary school is these skills. And I think there's an element where we think about that IB teacher and that the secondary school people, how do they ensure that they're still looking at those wider skills and monitoring those wider skills or evaluating them as wider skills within their curriculums whilst they're developing the geography, the maths, the history? How are they giving them opportunities to push those skills a little bit further in line with how maybe our FS teachers would do it? Letting them explore, letting them make mistakes, letting them do little projects on their own and leading their own learning with agency, as well as coming to fit in with the rubrics of assessment. I think that's important. I think also flipped it back the other way. There is an element where children at some point will have to conform, and even though we're teaching them to develop in the early years, they have to be ready at some point for some of the things to change. And I think sometimes in FS, what we get into this routine of is play. It's all these things going on, and are we really preparing them for when things change? Because do we put them through that moment of risk enough where actually things are going to change in life? And are we preparing them for that when that happens? I think maybe not. And I think maybe in our later years we do. They start to contemplate different problems that might occur. I think in our early years they're developing. We're sometimes a little bit scared of saying to them, right, let's remove this, see what happens, or you're going to shift to here today, and that's going to happen. We kind of wrap them a little bit in cotton wool, but it's a bit of both, I think.
That's great. Loretta, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess similar to what Dave was saying. I mean, in my career in education, I've really had the privilege of working with children under 3-year-olds, but also 8th graders, and that's a wide range. And I've enjoyed both for different reasons, but I guess what I realized when I was teaching 4th grade math and we were doing addition with several digits and carrying over, how important it hit me, how important it was for those 3-year-olds to be putting eggs into a basket or an egg carton, and it made the connection to me. And I wonder if data, when we all sit together or we all have those experiences of having to look at data or collect data in different age levels, of different development, if we have those moments as well of why what we do is so important in that moment for the long term, right? And what that looks like on the other end, so that we get that more holistic picture of the child. I also have, as you asked this question, I also had this image in my head of a evergreen branch. And you have this picture of this branch and you can see the evergreen and it's beautiful. And it's got these little, green stemmy pointy bits sticking out of it and you can see the whole picture. And then this image of each one of those little pointy sticks taken out and put into a bar graph beside it. And there's ways of looking at something. You can look at it and it gives you something. And sometimes it looks just like a picture. It's a beautiful picture. That's all it is. And if you zoom in too close, it gets blurry and you can't even quite tell what it is. And you can also take it apart and organize it and structure it in a certain way. And I think there is value in all of those different ways of looking at things. And I think what maybe people in the younger grades could learn is the way to look at things when you take them apart and look at them more closely in a structured way, versus I think what older grades could learn is to sometimes look at things very closely when it looks super messy, but then also zoom out and then just see the picture of it, even when it doesn't look like data. So I think that's what I'd say in terms of the benefits for all of us when we learn from each other and with each other.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
Both of you are talking a lot about the idea of change. How do we help teachers change their perceptions of data, change the school culture of data, change parents' ideas of data? And just sort of connecting back to that beginning part of the conversation where we were talking about the data, Dave, you mentioned in that initial story. There are some teachers that are very attached to that way of thinking about it. And there are also teachers who are very turned off by the data, right? There are a lot of teachers I know who, would say things like, "Oh, I'm not really a data person," right? Or I don't like looking at data. I guess I'm curious, when you're working with teachers and looking to shift the ways of thinking, is it that people are clinging to the old, or are they afraid of the new? Are they afraid, where are those barriers to change? I guess is the question here. What do you think, Dave?
I think, it's tough, isn't it? When you try to describe people are the most curious and bizarre things you'll ever come across in life sometimes, that each one being completely individual and unique. And each has their own idiosyncrasies about the things they like to do and the things they don't like to do. I think teachers are a breed of themselves and a breed on their own. They're wonderful people. They're there to help children. And each one of them, I like to believe, has the children at the heart of everything that they do. No matter which way they do it, no matter which way they get the child to develop and the child to think and the child to grow, every one of them, I like to think through that lens of they're all here for that sole purpose, right? I think changing people's mindsets often comes, I think I touched on this before, it comes back to maybe the historical training that teachers are given in, for example, England. I remember when I did my PGC or my GTP, and I sat there in the room and they told me about data and about using data, and it was never about the social data, it was never about the emotional data, it was purely about finding gaps, planning intervention groups. It was using it that way. There was nothing in my training that accessed other elements of data or learning. And I think when you have developed that over time, and then you've been in institutions where maybe actually you are made accountable for that element of what data is. So you've lived a life of being a teacher where you're in a school where if your results matter, that you have to get a result, that's what you're judged on. Changing their mindset about how they do things is very, very difficult. And I would never, I don't think I've mastered the skills to change people's mindsets yet, but it's about just that awareness of them, and they still want the same thing. Everybody in that room wants the same thing. I've had this conversation about parents before as well, when they've talked to me, and teachers will come and say, "Oh, they're really cross, they're really angry, they're this." Yes, they are, because they care. At the bottom of it all, they care about that child, and their emotions that they're showing you now is because they want the best for them. Now, whether that teacher is someone who drives data from numbers or someone who drives it and hates it, I hold my hand up. I'm not the biggest data guy in the world, unfortunately, and my role is that at my school. because my background is pastoral, but I still believe there's a place for it. And there's a place for both the people that can use it in that way and the place for the people that can use it another. But it's about combining the two and making them see each other's perspectives for me. I don't think you'll ever change them. I really don't. I don't think you can change the habits of a human when sometimes they're so ingrained. And I think it comes back to changing the way that we educate teachers through CPL, and we go through from their early career through to their middle career, because they get into routines and habits. Like I'll hold my hands up. I do that. I go into a classroom, I have routines and habits that I stick to, that I know that I'll follow. And I'll suddenly find myself going, oh, actually, no, we're not going to do that today. Let's try something different. But it's a mindset, and it's part of who we are and who we are as a teacher, and your identity as a teacher, I think, that creates these different, almost like chalk and cheese, aren't there? There's people that do this, there's people that do that. Finding those in the middle that do both. I don't know how many of those exist yet in the world.
Lou, I'm going to disagree, Dave.
All right, that's what we're here for, right?
I do think it is possible to change people's mindsets around data. My whole mindset around data changed. I used to see it as like, it's something I had to be accountable for, it was compliance. I just had to do it because that's what somebody up there decided. And now I have to collect data to show parents, but I already know the kids. I don't understand why I have to do that. I really did think that several years ago, when I was in the classroom. And so I think our, image of ourselves as educators is really, really rooted in our why, of why we're there, what our role is, and also our image of children and what they're capable of. And I think in my role as curriculum coordinator, it's really about giving teachers that same agency that I also love students to have, and seeing them as really competent educators and human beings. And so instead of telling them, what it needs to look like and what it needs to happen, just allowing ourselves to be messy with what we collect and keeping what we value at heart at the forefront of it. We want to see children for their whole selves. And so let's get messy with this. How can we do that? Does this show us all of it? What do we notice when we look at it like this? What do we notice like this? Who has other ideas of what we're missing or what we're not noticing, or, and just being together. And just like we allow children to be messy with our learning, I love ourselves and that grace to do the same thing. As long as we align on what we value, I think there is definitely a way forward. And I think I've seen that at our school as well. I'm on the Wiesbaden campus, which is a slightly smaller school. And we started off where it was a little bit more directed by administration. Like, we're going to look at these data, we're going to do some data dives. This is how we're doing it. And now, third year into it, teachers pull it out themselves. They ask to do it. They want to do it. And they're asking more questions around what other self-surveys can we do to collect social emotional learning? Is the self-survey really giving us a full picture of the child and where they're at? Do children really self-report on certain things? So we're constantly asking ourselves questions, and it's the teachers that are nudging us to look for other resources out there, to find those, to bring those back, to look at them together and to see what works best. So, yeah.
I wonder if I can name a couple of things that seem to be threads that are running through this, right? We're talking a lot about mess. We're talking a lot about balance and duality and either or and conflicting forces, etc. I don't know of a school with whom I'm working at the moment that isn't trying to wrestle with how to co-create the optimal dashboard, right? Because it's fine for me as an English teacher. When I was a classroom teacher, I taught a small number of kids a lot of hours. But there are many teachers in our schools who teach a large number of kids a small number of hours, right? So we need to find ways for them to be able to see the summary of a student's story, and for us as senior leaders to be able to kind of zoom out and from a satellite level do the same. So here's the question. How do we honor the importance of that child's individual, unique story with the need for school-wide dashboards and those data systems and structures? Can we have dashboards that honor individuality, or are we asking for the impossible?
That's like the $1 million question, isn't it?
Well, it is, Loretta, but I also think, you guys are all, you guys are wrestling with that yourselves. I know in both of your schools, you're trying on different analytics 100%. Platforms for size and trying to figure out which ones actually do what you want them to do and will work for all stakeholders, etc. So it's $1 million question without a doubt, but it's that $1 million question with which pretty much every school I know is wrestling, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And my prediction is, even when we get really close to what we think honors that individual student within the systems and structures of a school, we will continue to wrestle with it. I believe that it's probably going to be that journey of like continuously trying to figure it out. What I do see as a possibility in kind of this trial and retrial and whatnot is to have a framework, but different pathways within that framework so that we can still know what it is that we're looking for, but honor that individuality of different kids. So to me, that's, a simplified answer to an incredibly complex question, but yeah.
Yeah, if I add on to that from Loretta, I think the dashboard's become highly complicated and complex as one of my projects that I'm working on at school. In my mind, I believe that it's the page you land on that breeds what you are as a school. I think we've talked about this, Matthew, like you watch, for example, there's thousands of millions of dollars gone into developing the smartwatch. So you always use this example with me. And what you land on is what they've decided is most important. And you start to believe that. You start to watch it. You start to edit it. You start to change it. And I think if we talk about that data culture at the start, what it means and what we value in a child, that idea of what our constellation exists on that landing page is vitally important on a dashboard. Can you get something that matches across? Well, actually, I don't see why not. Because you want to cover every part of a child on that landing screen. You need to see little bits of information about them. You need a little bit of academic stuff. You need a little bit about their background, about who they are. You need their ECAs. You need their attendance. You might want a little button that includes something about where the students contributed, where they said something about themselves, or where a parent's added a little bit of information about termly thing. And I think that's something FS do really well, is they have focused children at our school and they'll contact parents and glean information from what a child likes at home. It's a complicated situation to get it all on one page and to get it set and to get it right, I think. But I think every person has to land on the same page, because otherwise, if they don't, they'll go straight into valuing the numbers that they want. So I've currently got a dashboard that sits there and it looks very number driven. And actually, if I go into it, I instantly see these numbers and I'm turned off. I'm not that person. It's not the way my brain works. I want something easy and simple to look at that tells me something about the child. But then when I want more, I can dive further into it. So if I want to know more about their maths, I can press on the attainment section and go through into the mathematics area of them. If I want to know about what ECAs they're doing on a Thursday night, I can click on this, or what ECAs they've done throughout their history, because on a Thursday, he's always really grumpy. And actually, I don't know why he's grumpy. Oh, it's because he hates golf. Okay? He absolutely hates golf, and his mum and dad have put him in it for the last 7 weeks or the last 7 months, and he's still doing it now, but he doesn't dare tell them. But I think a dashboard is achievable. It's very difficult when you've got so many stakeholders wanting to change what it looks like. And it comes back to that landing page being a reflection of what your school believe. And I think every school believes a whole child exists. So I don't see why, even if your mission and vision is to, I don't know, get 100% at IB or whatever, or high IB scores, that might be what your why is for a secondary school. You still want to see a whole child there sitting before you learn anything more about them. And I think that's where I'm at the moment. Like, I know Matthew's talked to me a little bit about, we've talked about constellations and things, but that is something people want as well. I've spoken to people at my school when I mentioned the idea of having bits on there about a child, that what's their likes, what are they into at the moment, where a child adds something. They want to know it, because what they want to do is they don't want to create a comprehension about, I'm thinking about my own daughter, horses, because she loves horses, because that'll then get her to adapt in the classroom better. They want to know about their ECAs, because what is their home life like? What is going on at home? How long are they here for? Why on a Wednesday are they tired? Because they stay up late. I guess the question sometimes is, when you look at some of that wider scope in data, it's the validity of it. And that's a question some people have asked me recently. They said, how do we know it's real and how do we know it's correct if we're asking parents, asking students? And my flip on that is, how do you know that test is right? How do you know they didn't cheat? How do you know they didn't do this? Because actually, the more we have, or the clearer constellation we have about that child, is better, because that's telling us more parts of their journey and part of who they are. I think that's right, Matthew. You mentioned about whether you could get to a dashboard and a thing, and I think that is something that is achievable. I think as we've talked about, that page, that first landing bit is where everybody should go, because that's what pushes your culture through the school as a visual.
I love that, Dave. And, even essentially, because if you talk about everything being messy, the key ingredient of a dashboard is that it's tidy. So I suppose that's why we find this difficult, because we're trying to take something messy and represent it in a tidy way. But I think recognizing that smartwatch analogy that we've talked about, even this morning, just to share a little anecdote, I found this playing out in my own life. So as you know, Dave, I looked at my watch to tell me how good a night of sleep I've had, right? And last night I got 88% for my quality of sleep, and I got the highest score possible for my sleep fuel and my readiness for the day, okay? But I had some of the worst nightmares I've had in months last night. Now, my dashboard didn't capture that at all, but I guarantee you that one of the biggest forces on how successful and thriving I am today will not be the high scores for my sleep fuel and readiness. It'll be the fact that I had some really powerful nightmares last night. So it's that $1 million question you said, Loretta, but there's a really important, albeit challenging, kind of tension there. How does the tidy represent the mess without reducing the mess in order for it to be represented, I suppose? So no simple answers there, but I think there's an agreement here. We've got to kind of move in that direction, right?
Yeah. And I think like what both of you were saying too, like that alignment to the mission and the vision, and then who is part of that, right? Like in your smartwatch thing, you didn't get to add anything to that data dashboard, right? It was just the smartwatch kind of deciding. And so make sure kids' voices are in there, like Dave said. Make sure parents' voices are in there, like Dave said. Make sure the specialist teachers are in there as much as maybe an after-school activity. So the community, right? Depending on that. And what is in there? Is it just the quality of sleep, or is it also the nightmares that are in there, or whatever else?
It's interesting. I had people say, I'm not sure I'd use that data. And I believe that even if it's in your visual and it's constantly in your visual, at some point you're going to refer to it. You're going to remember it. You might not click on it. You might not click on the Quinn likes horses or go down that route at all at any point, but it's always there just looking at you, and it updates and it changes. And eventually you're going to think about that at one point when you're thinking about something that's gone wrong later. I don't know, they've had a fallout. Oh, it says here that they've not been sleeping for the past 6 weeks. I've noticed that, and there's reasons for it. And yeah, it's, we talk about people being number driven or being kind of social, emotional, data driven. If it's in front of you, you'll absorb it, even if you don't believe you are. And then it's that absorption and access without realizing you're accessing it that will eventually change mindsets of people, which I said maybe couldn't change, but I think maybe Loretta's probably changed my opinion on that a little bit.
Woo!
Just a comment on that. It makes me think a little bit of, there's a scholar, Marshall McLuhan, who his sort of catchphrase, or the phrase that everyone remembers him by, is that the medium is the message. And thinking about how a dashboard is a medium and the ways that they're built and delivered to teachers or to other audiences, it's not value neutral. It affects the way that people think about things, right? And it's interesting, like we're moving into a more fluid state of things. We started off with static PDF or paper type of reports, digital paper, real paper, moving to sort of active filters where you can click around a little bit. And now things are moving even more fluid to more AI driven types of stuff, where potentially everybody is seeing what the algorithm predicts that they want to see based on the conversations they've had and the requests and things like that. And I can almost see things going to the point where everyone's getting what they want, but there is no common message anymore. And I think, Dave, what you're suggesting is that there's got to be a middle ground somewhere. Like we need to be shaping that conversation as a community of what do we value as a school, and shape people's perceptions and values through that, but also give people some flexibility so that they can find what they want and it makes sense to them. Let's ground it a little bit. Can you think of a time where all of these data conversations that we're having actually had a real impact on a child or on a teacher, perhaps, where you could see like the way that we were seeing them and they felt seen, it made a difference for that child.
I do have a story. Yeah, it comes from my own practice, really, and my own teaching in class when I was in class as a class teacher. It kind of drives where I am kind of thinking about our school and about what we're trying to achieve and how you blend different types of data together to get a bigger picture, right? So I had a student who was particularly high needs. He had fought fights. He would shout at mum and dad. He would F and blind. He wouldn't come into the classroom. He wouldn't do anything. And I'd been told that he was this and that and the other, and he shouldn't be at the school. And a lot of the messages that were coming from many other people were this. All these other things about this is that we can't cater for him. We can't do this. We can't do that. He was coming. He was accessing. Was he actually learning anything? Probably not. But in the small moments, he was when he was at school. And there was all these things put in place to make him come in. And it kind of boils back to where I thought beyond the numbers, and people were thinking he can't access school because he can't access the learning, and he can't sit in mathematics, and he can't do literacy, and he can't do this, and he can't do that. And at that moment, I was kind of reflective and thought, what do I want him to be able to do? Well, I want him in my classroom. I want him to enjoy coming to school, first of all. I want him to be happy when he's at school, because I can't influence many of the things when he goes outside of school because it's a complex nature of his relationships with parents outside. What that then made me think about is how do I get him in, and what is the data that I need to use to get him in? And I started to look at the bigger picture that surrounded him, what he liked, what he was into, the days of the week when he maybe slept better, the days of the week when he didn't sleep so well, how he got home on an evening. And I started to predict the patterns of nature of his behaviour when he came into my room. So in the morning, I knew, on, for example, a Tuesday, he'd had football in CA the night before, and he'd probably had a fight. He'd probably got overheightened, overexcited because he loved football, gone home, he'd argue with mum and dad because they weren't there to watch him. And then Tuesday morning, he wouldn't come in the classroom, he'd be outside arguing with mum saying he wanted to go home, and they always let him down. But I knew that because of the little things I started to consider. And they're like changing moments for me when I think about that individual child and about my pedagogy, because it's not always about a successful child is not always about, like we said before, a number or learning in maths in a room. It's about actually having them in the room and engaging with other people. And for him, the learning was not your usual type of learning that you might say is your traditional classroom. It was him getting in, socializing, being there, being present, and learning that he can cope with things that go wrong. And yeah, that's kind of a story from me of how I've used that other wider bit of data. I think does that help? Did that answer it? It shifted my perspectives. I think sometimes you're faced with challenges with children that you don't know how to work out. And if you haven't got an open mind to all the different elements, then you can't, there's no figuring them out. You can be really narrow and go down a path of, I need to get him in, I need to sit him down, I'm going to give him a thing to kick under the table. That's not going to help you get him there. That's not going to help them learn. And yeah, that's kind of, and built back to the kindness and that, but he was one. There's been a few like that. And it's always those higher challenging children that I think test us and push us to look differently. And because they don't immediately fit in what the norm is of that classroom or of that school at that moment in time. But it's how we as a school then go, what can we do? And what are the first steps to make them feel success, achieve, like they actually belong and want to come.
And what is helpful for everyone is absolutely essential for those individual kids who are at the margins. Loretta, did you want to share a story too?
I have a story too. Also, like Dave, from when I was in the classroom with 4 and 5 year olds, so preschool. And there was a brand new kid that came to our school that year. She's very sweet, smart, participated, a little shy, but fine. Mom was lovely. Dad was lovely, well-educated parents. I'm collecting all this data in my head. But this kid would bump into things all the time. She ran into a post, had no spatial awareness, floppy on the carpets in the afternoon. So I started, writing down, collecting all this data of what was happening. And I had a pretty good picture that this child needed occupational therapy. I had my bar graph. This is how many times she's getting hurt. This is how many, in the afternoon she's floppy. She doesn't have core muscle strength. We got to build this. I've been an early years practitioner for years. It was just after COVID. Kids have been sitting in front of the screen. I knew what was going on in the world. I had that data too. I had data on the specific child. So I went and I wanted to speak to mom, and I started the conversation. And I usually start with how do you think things are going? And so it was a very kind of open conversation to start off with. But I had my data and I had proof that she needed OT. And so mom started telling me that the move to Germany had been a really, really tough one for her, and that she was experiencing some anxiety at home, that she was sticking to rules as much as she possibly could, that there were things that she was afraid of doing. And all of a sudden, the data that I thought that so neatly proved that she needed occupational therapy looked different to me. I started to wonder if perhaps it wasn't occupational therapy she needed, but maybe just some comfort in the fact that this move and this transition was going to be okay. And it had been anxiety around COVID and moving and just settling in. So what ended up happening is we gave her 6 weeks to kind of settle in a little bit more, to come back and look at what was still happening in her life. And we also, she started some play therapy. And lo and behold, she was no longer running into things. She wasn't bumping into things. So this original data that to me proved that she needed occupational therapy was incomplete. So it showed this beautiful graph of what she needed. But when I zoomed out and looked at that evergreen tree with the perspective of the parent who provided some data as well, I was able to see a bigger picture of the whole child and what they really needed. And I think that is when I started to realize that curiosity is so important when we look at data, and curiosity around what we see, what we're not seeing, and what we're looking at, and through which lenses we ourselves as educators are looking at that, and what perspectives and lenses might be missing to that. So yeah, that's my story.
Both beautiful stories, and I think that that's a great place for us to close today's conversation. Thank you, Loretta. Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you both of you. It's been brilliant.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.